All right. I have a bunch of tabs open, so there will be a few or several times actually where I will be switching over so that you can see what I'm actually talking about. If you got Carol's email yesterday, a lot of the resources that are being used in this presentation were embedded in those links. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Liz Ramos, who's here. She was the author, is the author of the EdSurge article that I sent out, and she and I serve on the educational advisory board to the Situation Room. So Liz is also a wealth of resources, and I'm not saying that just because we're both named Elizabeth. So just a little background on me. I am a journalist. I've been a journalist my whole life. I always tell my students when I was in 4th grade, I grew up in the military, so we moved around a lot. And in 4th grade, I started a news school, and I thought it was a tragedy that they didn't have a school newspaper. So I went to the principal and I asked him if I could start a school newspaper. He said yes. So I was the editor, reporter, designer. I stapled the editions of the paper together and would hand them out. I like to tell my students, I put that together. We had traveling Apple computer labs that would come and they'd be on campus for a week. So I would always do the newspaper then. But since then, I have always been involved in a newsroom of some sort. I started out working in professional print newspapers. I started out at the Newport Daily News in Newport, Rhode Island, which evolved from the Newport Mercury, which is the oldest newspaper in the United States. It was also the newspaper that had the first female editor. Her name was Anne Franklin. She was the sister-in-law of Benjamin Franklin. So a lot of history there. Loved working there. Started my career there. While I was in Newport, I got the opportunity as an editor and a reporter to cover local politics, national politics. The 2000 election was just ramping up when I started. Newport, Rhode Island is not far from New York City. So we covered 9/11 as a quasi-local story because we had so many people who were commuting back and forth from the city. Our first responders went. Now I am the director of Pepperdine Graphic Media here at Pepperdine. That's our student news organization. And I'm also a journalism professor. And my research heavily focuses on news literacy, accuracy in the news, digital innovations in the news, and then also learning in newsrooms. And I tweet a lot about news literacy. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see some of those. And you'll also, more importantly than me, you'll see some organizations that I can point you to that are doing such great work. All right, so why news literacy and why care about it so much? We know there are a lot of problems that are facing society right now, that are facing our school systems right now. And I think that actually news literacy is at the heart of a lot of those. So when I was first reporting, I was covering a local election in Newport. And I remember I went to a debate. I was covering the youngest candidate to run for city council. So we were covering all the layers of elections, all the levels of elections. And I remember I went to the debate, covered the debate, and the next day I got a phone call from somebody who said, I think that you were really biased toward one candidate. And honestly, I cannot even remember now the names of the candidates or who they accused me of being biased toward. And I was a 22-year-old and I asked, well, what makes you think that? And so we had this conversation and I remember thinking in my head, I actually don't even care who wins this election. I was new to the city and I really didn't have a preference, and it was really funny to me. And that experience really stuck with me. As I progressed through professional newsrooms, I really started to understand that this accusation of bias, sometimes legitimate, sometimes not, is always sort of around when we think about audiences, and that we really have to think about what those perceptions of bias mean and when bias can creep in. And it got me really invested in understanding audiences more. So when I came back to grad school, I studied perceptions of bias in the news. And I particularly looked at perceptions of bias of the LA Times among racially minoritized communities. And so I was tracking their perceptions of bias and then how they were supplementing their news with their news, meaning the LA Times. And so that has always stuck with me. I have continued that line of research. But 2015, 2016, we saw a renewed discussion around the idea of misinformation, which is often called fake news. I don't use that term, but I use misinformation, but all talking about information that is not accurate, or disinformation, which is information that has been created to intentionally mislead or create division. And then in the last year, or since the start of COVID, scholars, practitioners, journalists, but also health experts are calling the pandemic really an infodemic, because every aspect of the pandemic has been exacerbated by a flood of misinformation, making it so much harder to communicate accurate information to all communities. So this is just a screenshot, actually. The WHO, the World Health Organization, partnered, and this was early in 2021, partnered with UNICEF, the UN, UNESCO, UNAIDS, a bunch of global organizations and NGOs, really putting out a call, not encouraging, but a call to manage the infodemic better. And that looking at the infodemic and the misinformation around COVID and the disinformation around COVID, and also the health measures in place to manage or treat or even try to reduce numbers of cases, was really not working because of the level of misinformation. So that's where we are. For me, this interest in perceptions of news really started so many years ago, really early in my professional career. And today, the idea of news literacy and how we can teach kids to be more news literate. So a couple of things that I want to say at the outset. This is not a conversation where I'm going to try to persuade you about one particular news organization. And it's not a conversation where I'm trying to persuade you to love journalists. What news literacy really is about is empowering you with information. And what we hope is that you can then empower your students with information. And I want to say too, and when I'm saying educators, I mean you guys, boots on the ground. Yes, I teach, but in a different context than a lot of you teach. I'm sorry that this has to fall so much on classes and teachers and the education system. But I do think that if we're teaching and empowering students at all levels with news literacy, we will see great rewards in the coming months and years. I love K through 12 teachers. My husband is one, my sister is one, my brother-in-law is one. I'm surrounded by wonderful educators in the K through 12 arena, community college educators. And so the idea is, there is a lot we can say about what has been done wrong in the news. And the other thing is I will share these slides because they have a lot of resources in them. And also I'm available to talk. So if anybody has follow-up questions, or if you want to talk more specifically about specific things in journalism, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email is in this presentation as well. So I'll make sure you all get these slides if you want them. So I want to oops, let me go back. So much time using Zoom and I still have my slides advanced when I don't want them to. So I want to debrief the simulation that you all went through. And then we're going to talk a little bit about trust in news. I think it's really important that we talk about how low trust in news is and why some of that trust is not warranted, and where you can see where journalism is really trying to counteract some of that trust with transparency and other trust items. We're going to really define news literacy, and then we can think about how teaching news literacy, how to teach news literacy, and some different options, from full courses to simulations to embedded items across different subjects. And then really what is still needed. And we're going to talk about some of the limitations with some of these tools. Primarily, there's not a lot of these tools in the United States that are meant to be bilingual or cater to non-English speaking audiences. So we need to have a real push for that because it's just as important. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, but I really want to hear from you all. Oops. What did you think of playing the role or playing the roles of journalists? What was terrible about it? What was fun about it? And are there any big takeaways from that quick experience? I mean, I know it was an hour, but it feels really quick. I've played the simulation several times. My students have done the simulation, so I know how fast the time can go. So let me know what you thought. So what went well? What didn't? Big takeaways. Yeah, Rick, I see your hand. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. One of the challenges we had was that our two of our participants dropped out.
Yeah.
So, and I didn't know that, and so I'm trying to make a decision with my partner, and then finally, I think it was Jane told me that they dropped out. But one of the, as far as the pace, you know, I've been to the Situation Room at the Reagan Library with classes, I think 11 times, and then I've done this with Jane in the spring. You know, simulation. I don't think it's too fast. You got to keep up. I understand that, but I don't know if I was supposed to, but I kept getting notices that I had news. And every time I clicked on it, there was nothing there.
Oh.
So
Okay,
I'm not sure why. Yeah,
that's a good note. Thank you. But you didn't think it was too quick. You thought the pace was right.
No, but I'm probably more used to it than a lot of people.
Yeah. D. Reeve or Dr. Eve, I'm not sure. If your hand is up, go ahead.
Yes. Hopefully you can hear me. The D is my first initial. It's okay to call me David.
Okay.
For me, the computer technology is still confusing to me. I didn't go to a residential college, in-class college until after I retired from the Army. Mm-hmm. And computer applications was a cliff to me. And for me, that made it confusing and too fast, but I can also see where the younger folks that are not in their 50s would really enjoy this. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, no, I think it, yeah, you have to get used to a new platform really quickly in this. Yeah, Phil?
I'm going to put a disclaimer in. I'm working in an area that's somewhat related to this as a doctoral student. So one of the things I thought was interesting was my perception of it was that the informal speech, the tweets or chirps or whatever they were, was very difficult, but the formal reading was fairly easy. But for students, the opposite would probably be true. They'd probably be much more fluent on the tweets and have much more difficulty navigating the news because that would be more academic. So that might be something to look at, is to say, what kind of scaffolding or supports would you provide for that reading and distinguishing the crucial point. For instance, Greg was the one who picked up the number, the 90 versus the 97% on one of the news. Mm-hmm. And most kids, I also teach middle school, most kids that would blow right by. Yeah. So I thought it was very interesting. I think the gamification thing is really cool, but I could see how it's going to have a different feel for us than it would for the middle schoolers or high schoolers.
Yeah. And, you know, those differences, the details of the 90 versus the 97%, we want those to be tricky for the students because it is easy to miss those, right? For really, that could be true for anyone. Anyone else? I thought I saw another hand up. Brianna and then Melody. Oh, you're muted, Brianna. Yeah.
So again, like with the person said, our news thing wasn't clicking. So I wasn't sure if that was because of my position or not. I really enjoyed it. This is really fascinating. I think my students, I teach high school English, and I think they would, this would actually be something very useful and relevant to them. But I would like to have maybe like a like showing them how to do it first before they get overwhelmed. That's the only thing I would see as a problem.
Yeah.
With them first.
Yeah, thank you. And then Melody.
Yeah, I was the news editor, so I don't know if I was getting everything that I was supposed to be getting. I kept clicking tabs and it was just a blue screen. So I don't know if that was because of my position that I was in versus some of the other ones. So not, and I didn't go through the tutorial or anything to kind of figure that stuff out first. But I also was in agreement with the formal versus informal. Most of the kids using tweets and stuff like that are definitely going to go more for the informal. So almost trying to figure out who your audience would have been. You know, if you're chirping it, most of your audience is going to be a younger generation, where if you're posting something else, maybe on a Facebook, it's going to be, the demographics are going to be a little bit bigger. So I don't know if trying to give that to the kids to understand versus, you know, I don't know. Just some thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. For any of you outside of just how, and those are all really good notes, and Mira and Jane are hearing all of this too. And they're more on the technical side of it. But for any of you, as you were going through it, did you have, and I know this is a question that I'm sort of priming you for, and you've sort of already been primed for, but was there any moment where you paused and thought about what journalists are actually doing? And the nature of that work in a situation where we have a breaking news story that also becomes an evolving or a developing news story. David, I see your hand up.
Thank you. During the entire simulation, I was thinking, oh my goodness, I have been so judgmental on newspaper reporters for so long. And that's mostly because when I got back from Operation Iraqi Freedom, what I saw on the news and read in the newspapers compared to what I had been in less than 24 hours ago was so different that I just automatically distrust journalists, but journalists aren't there.
Well,
they
are. In some cases they are. Maybe not exactly where you were, but journalists are usually embedded, and they have been embedded in most of the conflicts since Vietnam. And Vietnam was really the last time where we saw journalists moving unilaterally, you know, outside of the military. Now they're generally embedded with troops.
I agree, but I was so far north that that's not where the news was in Iraq. It was south of me.
I got you.
So I can't blame them too much. But unfortunately, that experience has really colored my outlook on journalism.
Yeah, and I think
too much.
Well, that's really important. And when you say you can't blame them, I think even if they're not there, it's still their job to be accurate, right? And that's my opinion. So not being somewhere is not an excuse for incorrect information. Liz?
When we had our discussions on the different topics, I know somebody had shared something. I'm like, well, who was the source? Who was that from? And trying to keep that in that frame of mind, going with those like historical thinking skills, and also like what journalists do, like consider the source, and being careful not to stoke fear in that sensationalism aspect, and really trying to be cognizant of that as we were making our decisions.
Yeah, so I mean, what you're really getting at, and what those choices are sort of meant to also touch on, is not just the work of journalists, but the responsibility that comes with the work of journalism. Yes. Rick, and then Pam. Thank you, Liz. Rick, and then Pam.
So again, I've been to the Situation Room at the Reagan Library many times. And for those of you who haven't been there, they have 4 networks. Students play roles in 4 different networks, and they have monitors on the wall. And one of my favorite things to do there is watch all 4 of them. They're right next to each other, and they're all reporting on the same event and saying different things. Mm-hmm. I just always thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I love that about the Situation Room too. Pam?
I think, yeah, am I unmuted? Yeah.
Yes.
You know, I think for me, the first time I wanted to have a chance to read, you know, a little bit more deeply. And I think that was one of the things that on any kind of a simulation, you walk away suddenly saying, oh my gosh, those decisions had to be made very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And just even as we were choosing, you know, who we were really going to feature in those articles, made me aware of the fact that it's really important that we read a variety of different newspapers. And I'm more of a newspaper person rather than a media person, but that we read a variety of different newspapers. That's one of the reasons I like the newspaper, is because you have almost a point counterpoint on the same page, you know, and so you're getting that, and you're getting it from those smaller voices. But how important it is, wherever we are, that we know that what's happening for us in one place may not be happening every other place. So we can't just.
Yeah. Well, Pam, you are a woman after my own heart, because I still love newspapers too. I love the print newspaper. I love the digital newspaper. I love the news. But we're not going to talk a lot about this today, but to your point, news consumption has changed a great deal. We know this, right? Most people, but when we think about our students, right? So middle school, high school, college, young adults are incidentally exposed to news instead of intentionally exposed to news. And I want you to also think about when, you know, and I know we have a wide range of ages in here. I'm 43. So I grew up with my parents getting the paper delivered, and we would watch the local news and then the nightly news from the networks, right? And that was our news consumption. And I saw my parents read the paper, and I saw my parents watch the news. But most news now is consumed through our phones. So our students, whether they are 10 or 25, aren't really seeing their parents intentionally consume the news, even if their parents are, right? So they just see phone. They don't know what's on that phone. It's not like opening the paper or turning it on TV, although the TV may be on, right? But the intentional news exposure, they're not getting it in the same way that we might have, because it's all happening on the phone alongside social media or any other apps that you're using, or your email, any other apps that you're using. So we have to really think about exposure is really different. Students are not intentional. And by the way, high school students, middle school students, even college students historically aren't intentional news consumers, but they are seeing news information. It's all incidentally though. And rather than caring as much about what organization is sharing it, they are more concerned by who is sharing it, right? So if a friend is sharing something, that's more trustworthy to them than the LA Times. I'm using LA Times because I'm in LA, but the LA Times sharing it. So we are dealing with a flood of misinformation, but also how we are exposed, and I mean young people, but it also affects every age group, right? Is different too. So I'm going to screen share again. And I think that as we are talking about this, it's really important to really start with that idea of trust. And I want to go back to what David said. You know, he saw incorrect information being circulated in the news, and it really did affect his trust. And that's really common. And although we have talked about misinformation or quote unquote fake news more since 2015, it's not a new problem, and neither is declining trust in the news. Oh, and one disclaimer also, trust and news literacy are not interchangeable, but trust does affect news literacy. So the next set of slides that I'm going to show you are actually provided by an organization that I've worked with. I have a ton of respect for them. I've worked with them quite a bit, called Trust in News, and they really train journalists to be more transparent. It's not that they're saying be more trustworthy, they're saying show why people should trust you, right? So that they will engage more with news content. So these set of slides around trust come from the Trust in News organization. So the decline of trust in the news really started in the late 70s, early 80s. And it is a complicated picture to look at when we look at decline of trust in news. It is the proliferation of cable news. It is the fracturing of our media landscape, right? It is the introduction of social news, the loss of a lot of local news outlets, as well as a flood of misinformation, right? And not just domestic, but international as well. So most Americans, and this is a Gallup poll in 2018, we actually had some new numbers that came out in 2021, and it has not gotten better, suffice to say. But over the last few years, most Americans have a negative view of the news. Fewer than half of Americans think that the news, these are adults, think that the news reports objectively. Local news does tend to have more trust, and that makes sense, right? You might know or feel like you know your local news station. So when you turn on Channel 5 and you see that same team on the morning show or on the evening desk, or those reporters out on the street, you might think, well, I actually know what they're saying is true because I saw it, or I've been watching them for years, and so I have some trust, right? So local news tends to have more trust, but all trust has declined. And local journalists are seen as more trustworthy and accurate and unbiased than national journalists or national reporters. So we do see a difference there, although it has declined with all journalists. A statistic that I think is really interesting is that only 21% of Americans say they have ever met a journalist or spoken with a journalist. Now, it is quite possible that someone has spoken with a journalist and not known it, right? If I'm at the grocery store, someone might have spoken with me and not known that I'm a journalist, but knowing that someone is a journalist, only 21% of Americans. And that number declines the less wealthy you become, the less white you become, and the less educated you become. So what that means is very few people are interacting with journalists, and very few outside of affluent, white, educated communities are speaking with journalists. That's a problem. So why would you trust someone you don't know, right? You wouldn't give me your ATM number. Please don't give me your ATM number because you don't know me. And so you have no reason to trust, right? So that's the way we approach this idea of trust with journalists. And it's one of the reasons why there are great efforts by news literacy organizations to plug journalists more in with educators and classrooms. Liz, am I correct that the News Literacy Project is doing that?
Yes, we are. It's free. You can sign up and get a journalist to come in your class. And having done that, it is amazing for the kids to hear firsthand from a journalist that what they do and their process. And I've had local journalists and I've had people who are on the ground covering Ferguson.
Yeah. And I'm going to show you toward the end of this discussion, some supplemental materials that we're trying to develop where even if you can't have a journalist physically come into your classroom, hopefully you could have one Zoom into your classroom, but also some ways where students can still learn some very specific digestible pieces of information that can bolster news literacy as they are going through modules or simulations or full curriculum. But I think it's really important to note that journalists shouldn't expect trust if people don't know them, right? And so there is a bigger effort to make sure. We also know that trust involves your heart and your head. You have to be thoughtful and smart about it, but you also need to feel that, affection, that effectiveness for journalists. And so that's another reason why exposing people to journalists as people, right? It is one thing to hear that journalism is a difficult job. It is quite another to talk to a journalist who was in Ferguson or was in Minneapolis covering protests or was on the ground at 9/11, right? Covering huge national tragedies, or here in California covering a wildfire, 72 hours straight. But good intentions don't result in automatic trust. So there are ways that journalists are closing the gap. And the reason I want to show you this is because one of the things that we know is journalists are really bad about talking about their work. They like to talk usually, and they like to talk about their stories, but they usually don't talk about the processes behind their work, right? We think no one's interested, that's not what's interesting, but it's really important that people understand how journalism works, which is a huge core foundation of news literacy. So first, there is a big movement to really train reporters to think of themselves as trying to teach people about trust and to earn trust. So understanding mistrust, addressing the misassumptions, and telling a better story about your journalism. So for understanding the mistrust, start by knowing what people really think of journalists' work in general. So some of those big statistics, but also specifically in your community. What do they misunderstand? What makes them mad? And I would actually also say, I would add to this and say, what makes them feel hopeless? When I talk to young people about the news, I was actually just talking to some high school students. They were seniors in high school, and they just kind of said casually, when I read or watch the news, I feel really hopeless. So I don't really like doing it. So really thinking about what emotions news consumption can leave our audiences feeling, and trying to understand better how we are affecting the audience in that way. And then remembering that mistrust and skepticism are valid in some cases, right? So I am not here to say that journalism is perfect and that it never makes mistakes. And you guys would laugh me out of the room, right? We all have an example of where we've seen big and small mistakes in journalism. That's true for every profession, but journalism is an outward facing profession, and it's powerful, right, in its reach. And so we have to be accountable for when those mistakes happen. And we have to understand where the mistrust and skepticism comes from. So some of the misassumptions: journalists do not pay for sources, ever, ever. You never pay for a source. That goes against all journalistic ethics. Now, you might have to fly to go meet a source, or you might have to fly a source to meet you, but that's different, right, than paying for a source. A source who wants to be paid, there are 1,000 red flags go up for any journalist. That they actively suppress information they don't agree with, and they choose stories that validate their own opinions. One of the things that journalists are trained to do is to recognize your own preferences, your own biases, so that when this can creep in, you are very aware of it. Like, I really kind of want this story to go this way, and to recognize that you might have that inclination so that you can correct from it. And it's also why stories are never just touched by one person. You're going to have a string of editors who are looking at it. You are going to have other people who are reading and fact checking your work. That money drives news decisions. Now, this one is important to talk about, because understanding the business of journalism is a core value of news literacy. Here's what I will say. Journalism is a business, and the way that it operates in the United States is that it has to be funded from revenue, and that revenue has to come usually from ad revenue or subscriptions. And so journalism has to make money. But I have worked in many newsrooms, and I've worked in newsrooms my whole life. Rarely ever, never, let me be very clear about this, never has a conversation happened around me or that I have ever been aware of or privy to where someone has said, this will sell, cover this. There is a very, very sacred line in journalism where we understand that there is a business behind it, but business doesn't drive editorial decisions. Usually in newsrooms, they don't even walk into each other's spaces. Yeah, Liz.
I love what you're saying about like getting to know what's going on behind the journalism, and the News Literacy Project has these things called News Lit camps, and they hold them in different places across the country, and they've been virtual, and they probably might be a little bit virtual in the beginning of the fall, where you get to go to a day of PD and talk to reporters. They go through the process. Before COVID, we got to go to the newsrooms. I did one in Chicago. We went to WBEZ and had the reporters in the room. I did one at UCLA where we had LA Times reporters talking about that. And to that point, and something I learned at the UCLA one that we had with the news titles, and the kids are surprised. They sometimes will have one title for print and then one title for web. And I did not know that, but that was something that the reporter had shared. And it's really nice to get the insights and having them talk about different topics from the reporters and getting to get that feel of journalism from them.
Yeah, thank you. And there's some real practical reasons. In print, you do actually have a specific space for a headline, Whereas online, you're going to have a little bit more flexibility, and you might find that a certain verb in a headline, this is not clickbait, right? But a certain verb might catch attention. Or sometimes we will do headline testing where you'll see that a story that you think really should be getting attention just kind of isn't. And maybe it's because the headline is flat, right? And it's not really highlighting or amplifying the story. That journalists sensationalize stories to get clicks, ratings, and money. Now we know what clickbait is. We've all seen it, and we've probably all clicked on it, including me. But that's generally not journalism. Now, if you see that a headline is going to say something that's scary, that's not the same thing as clickbait, right? If there's a terrible car crash and the headline says terrible car crash, or if there is a, God forbid, a shooting or a fire, I mean, the headline is supposed to highlight the most newsworthy and urgent aspect of the story. Journalists don't care about getting it right. This is one that I always like to address. I have never met a journalist. I know they have existed. There are very infamous examples, but I have never met a journalist who's working in bad faith. Just like teachers, right? We know there's always going to be a teacher who you hear about, but I've never met a teacher who goes into the profession in bad faith, right? You do it because you love education, you love kids, you love your subject matter. That doesn't mean it's easy, and that doesn't mean that mistakes aren't made, but you're working to get it right. Human error happens, and when it does, corrections should be made. And that journalists are just out to catch people looking dumb or doing something wrong. So remember, there are examples, right, of gotcha journalism, but most of that journalism doesn't really get you very far in terms of storytelling. You might catch people. Part of our job is to hold people accountable, hold city council accountable, your school board, your state house, of course, the federal government. But rarely is someone just trying to catch someone looking dumb, right? And politicians might not need any help with that. They're doing it on their own, and they have their own social media. It's really more about understanding policy and trying to make it accessible to the reader. All right. Okay. So thinking about what journalists are talking about, the values, the ethics of journalism, it's really important to understand that journalists realize they have a charge to minimize harm. Sometimes harm comes from a story, but they are charged with trying to minimize it. So to be transparent, if I'm going to do a big investigative story on city council, somebody might lose their job. Some harm might come to someone. But our job is to serve the public, the greater public, not one person who is in office or appointed to an office. Okay, so I just want to I'll go through these quickly. The idea of being more transparent or earning trust is really just showing a lot of the work that's already being done. So, for example, if you see questions that readers have or viewers have, so last summer, particularly with the Black Lives Matter protests, we saw a lot of discussion over the words that were being used to describe the protests, right? So you would hear or see some people on social media calling them riots, and then you would hear or see some people calling them protests, and then a variety of other words. And so here we see somebody asking on social media of a news organization, and I think the news organization is listed next, I can't remember off the top of my head, why aren't you calling these riots? So the news organization actually takes the time to answer this. We're very careful about how we label events, especially politically and historically loaded terms. Our job is to describe what we see in Kenosha or anywhere in enough detail where people can make up their own minds about what's going on. It's not our job to characterize events with the same words that political campaigns or other agendas might use. Rather, we aim to accurately and fairly report what we see in plain English, whether we're describing peaceful marches and demonstrations or violent clashes. And so you see them really taking the time to explain, not just that we don't use that word or that's a loaded term, right? But as we've seen in cities around the country this summer, protest participants and the activities surrounding them change throughout the day and night. Peaceful protests can happen all day long, and then fires can be set or violence occurs late at night by people not associated with the protesters. Would it be fair or accurate to label all that happened that day as a riot, especially in a headline summing things up? We don't think so. And there are historical racial overtones in the use of that word. So a reader might look at that and still be upset that the word wasn't used, but a reader cannot say that the journalist or the news organization has not taken time to explain what the rationale is behind a word being used in a headline or in the copy of a broadcast script or on a social media post or in a full story. And so we're seeing organizations are really taking time to do this now, to communicate not just the story, but decisions that are being made behind the story. So this is the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I have a friend who's the political reporter there. They have such great stories. But again, answering real questions in real time from audience members. Here we have another one from the Coloradoan, where they're explaining coverage of a particular suicide, right? So for journalism, historically, you don't report on suicides unless it's a public suicide or someone who is high profile, because then there's a different element of the news. But you don't just report on suicides because you don't want to encourage copycat suicides, right? So here they're explaining at the outset, right, before the question is asked, hey, we want to let you know why we're doing this, because it may seem out of step with journalism or it might seem shocking to you. So we want to explain what our decision making is. The San Diego Union Tribune, my hometown newspaper, has a fairness checklist, and every story is audited or checked against this checklist, and I love it. And this is posted on their website. So every story that's published has to be factually accurate, keep in mind our own values, cultural biases, preconceptions, and avoid imposing them on others. And you can look through there. Everyone who's reached for comment has to be given at least 24 hours to respond. So there's no like, hey, I'm going with this story. You've got 10 minutes and how can we expect someone to respond? Reconciling conflicting information, ensuring that no one is surprised. So even if it's an investigative story, that every source in the story or everyone named in the story knows this story is coming and that no one finds out when it's published. Here we have a news station, I think in Cincinnati, talking about why they're not reporting specific case numbers of COVID because the numbers were changing so rapidly. They didn't want to be incorrect or misleading about it. And then here talking about funding, right? So going back to those business models. So this is from NPR. This part is highlighted. We will tell you now that Amazon is a financial supporter of NPR News, and we are raising these questions about Amazon all the time, which is how it should work. So being very transparent that Amazon is a financial supporter of NPR News, but yet they are still holding Amazon accountable. Amazon is also the owner or part owner of the Washington Post. Jeff Bezos specifically, not Amazon. Okay, so anything you all want to jump in and say about trust? Did any of that, the good or the bad, resonate with you? Do you hear this talk among your students or colleagues? Not to put anyone on the spot, but. Oh, go ahead, Liz.
We've had that discussion with students, and I always come back to them that there's a difference between a website that's or social media site, wherever they're going, that says their news and that their friends or people are sharing as news, versus a news organization grounded in journalistic standards. And then even within that, to differentiate between the shows that like a cable news network, for example, may have, that is commentary show versus a news show. And that those lines have been blurred, and even sometimes a news show starting off with a monologue or their thoughts, and understanding when it's opinion, when that's fact, and all those. So those are important conversations, I think, as well to have with students, and that adults also need to know and be aware of. Just because you call your website a news site or put it out there to look like news doesn't mean it's news, because it's not grounded in those journalistic standards going through a checklist like you just showed.
Absolutely. And I will say, and I do want to be clear, I have really good friends and colleagues who work in cable news and are amazing reporters, but cable news has done itself and journalism and news literacy no favors. in the way opinion and reporting is often mixed in together. That doesn't mean a reporter out in the field is giving their opinion, but the way it's presented, it's all kind of in and out. And it's tough, really, honestly. If someone is only watching cable news and not getting news from other places, I see why there are so many red flags. So I always say, watch your cable news if you want to, but make that not your only source of news. And maybe limit it. Honestly, don't have it on all the time. Okay, so let me go back to my slide. So I want to define so there's trust, and that's a really important, and I think it's important to validate why there is some mistrust in the news, and why we have seen a decline. I also think it's important to validate what people are doing to be transparent and to build trust. But let's define what we mean by news literacy. So when we're talking about news literacy, this is from one of my favorite scholars. There's a set of scholars out there and who publish prolifically and study prolifically news literacy. And Vrega is one of them, and I can send this whole paper over to you if you're interested. But their 2021 definition of news literacy is the knowledge of the personal and social processes by which news is produced, distributed, and consumed, and skills that allow users some control over these processes. And I think that that's really important, because no one wants to feel like news is just being thrown at them, right? People want to have some agency. All people want to have some agency over the information that they're consuming. So to understand how it's made, distributed, and consumed, and then the skills that give you some agency over that news consumption. As part of this, understanding 5 parts of news. So the business models, which is really important, I think, especially when we talk about like declines in local news and news layoffs, and, to someone who has a busy life and is in a different industry, that may just not be clear why that's happening. The characteristics of journalists. So what's the ethos of journalists? What are the ethical standards that they operate under? Reporting routines. This is huge, right? When we're talking about processes, if I'm going out and covering this flesh-eating amoeba, what am I looking for? And are you aware, right, of how I'm verifying my information, what I consider to be credible information enough to share with an audience? Story structure, so use of sources, verification of information of news, and then how news is circulated and consumed. One thing I want to say too, I think in the last 5 years or so, there's been a vigorous interest in covering politics, especially national politics, and the White House, both the Trump and the Biden administration. And I get a lot of questions, and I think they're really good questions, about the use of anonymous sources. And why do I see so many anonymous sources when we're reporting on the White House? Or why do I see so many anonymous sources? And I won't defend every reporter's decision, but part of the reporting routines, but also use of sources, who gets to be anonymous, right? Okay, so we might understand why Deep Throat, was an anonymous source in Watergate, but what about, just a random anonymous source in this, kind of random story about something that's going on in the White House? So really understanding how those decisions are made. And then the last part of the definition of news literacy that I think is really important is this. Just because you have the knowledge and the skills does not mean you will act on them, okay? So there is this emerging idea of we want to teach and give skills, but what we really want to see, particularly with young people, is that they're connecting it back to their behavior of consuming news. And that's really challenging, right? Particularly because that age group, historically, they're not huge news consumers, but also because the landscape of news consumption is so different, with it being all social media. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. If you saw those two, or the email that went out, and there were 4 links in it, one of them being Liz's, which I'm so glad she's here for this. There are 2 particular links that are just amazing aggregates of, amazing aggregates. So I'm actually I'm gonna stop sharing and actually I have those pulled up. So I want to just switch over to those really quick. Oops, excuse me, give me one moment. So as I've done so much research on news literacy, I have found Common Sense Media to be a great place where in that they pull from a lot of different places, including places like Stony Brook. Stony Brook was the first college to create and deliver news literacy curriculum, and places like the News Literacy Project, right, which are really taking this holistic approach to education and really plugging professionals in, professionals and teachers. So let me go to, there we go. All right, so this link that I sent to you from Common Sense Media, it's very recent, January 12th of 2021. It has this great aggregate of news literacy courses and curricula. You can see Checkology here, which just won a big award, right, Liz? Yeah, from the Librarians Association, is that right? Applauding them for developing Checkology. I would venture to say Checkology might be one of the most famous resources available for teaching anyone, but particularly students, kids, about checking sources.
And it's
not
gone
just,
global.
oh, what's that?
And it's gone global. It's being used in some other countries as well.
Yes, thank you for that. And then you can see that there are specific fact checking. I'm going to show you a couple of these too. And what I really love is lesson plans. So I'm going to show you one of these too, a very thorough lesson plan that I think is actually pretty adaptable, and pretty adaptable depending on your topic too, or your discipline. Because one of the things, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, I think sometimes there can be an assumption that news literacy belongs to the English teachers and the history teachers and the government teachers. And so if you are an English teacher, a history teacher, or a government teacher, or a social studies teacher, you might feel the pressure, right? But it actually needs to be taught across disciplines, across classes, because we can certainly see how misinformation can be prolific, you know, in the scientific community, which is something that we've really seen this year. And then a bunch of videos that are great resources for teachers, but also for students, infographics and posters. So if you wanted to just put some up in your class, or if you wanted to hand them out, or even digitally just distribute them, and then some games, apps, and tools. But at the bottom of this list, this is really important, particularly if you are teaching English, or if you are a journalism advisor at the middle school or high school level. Here is where this is going to give you very specific information about journalism ethics. So the Student Press Law Center, what are you allowed to say, right? Or what are you allowed to publish on a high school campus, right? There was a big Supreme Court decision yesterday about the cheerleader, right? Who on her Snapchat posted some unfavorable things about the school. She used the F-bomb a few times, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Can the school discipline her? Which they did, but can they discipline her? And the Supreme Court ruled no, in 8-1, that was still protected speech. Now that may seem very specific, but when we're talking about sort of understanding, right, what is misinformation, sometimes the law is important to understand too. And I will tell you, the Student Press Law Center is one of the best resources that exists. I'm saying that from a journalist perspective and a journalism educator's perspective. They are the kind of organization that if you call them, their director answers the phone. I mean, they're just phenomenal. So if you have any questions about any of that, they're a great resource to call, email, reach out to. And then again, some other tools that you can use. So this resource on Common Sense Media is just phenomenal. And I highly recommend you spend a little bit of time, I'm going back to my slides, looking through those, going through those, because they can be really, really helpful, especially if you're trying to figure out, oops, sorry, wrong tab. I've been doing this for a long time, still can't figure it out, especially if you are trying to figure out how to embed it into your curriculum, and you're not going to have full courses. All right, so, you know, some options that you have depending on what you're doing and what your aim is, what your learning outcomes and objectives are, full curriculum. Now you could have that done in the class, or you could have that done asynchronously outside of the class. And I'll show you what I mean by that. modules that have already been created that you can modify, or you could create your own too, but there are some that are just available to you. Simulations like the one that you did today, or the in-person situation room. iThrive and the Reagan Library are developing a host of simulations. Some of them will be even hybrid. But these very immersive, hands-on, timed, low stakes, but high energy and high intensity learning experiences. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think makes those so special, particularly in terms of news literacy, and then just embedding it across your curriculum. So for full courses and modules, here is Checkology and the News Literacy Project. So Liz was just giving a shout out to how global it's become. It really is one of the most touted. I mean, I see it come up all the time in educator circles, in news literacy circles, even in journalism circles. And the great thing, I mean, Liz, feel free to chime in here, please. But one of the great things that I think is true about it is that it is created for a wide variety of learners. You can do this as an adult and learn something from it. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
True, and it's very engaging and timely and bipartisan in the topics that are utilized and brought in. There's a lesson in Spanish, more soon to come, and I know over the summer it's updated with like current examples and exemplars and some more challenges. But it is, I'm biased, but yeah, it's awesome.
I agree with your bias. I think it's amazing. I wanted to point out, there's also Pointer, if you haven't heard of it, the Pointer Institute. And I work with them on their educational advisory board as well. They have a host of classes. Some of their classes cost money, but some of them are free. And so the one that I'm pointing out here, News U, is a free course. It's 90 minutes, self-paced. By the way, if you want these slides, I'll share them with everyone. The links are all in the notes, so you'll have the links to everything. And this is a great class because students can not only gain some fact-checking skills, but it gives them an understanding of why things are fact-checked, not just the news, right? But all content should be a little bit fact-checked, even if it's by the consumer, right? So if something is suspect, right? And you don't know for a fact that's been fact-checked. So I think this is a wonderful resource, 90 minutes, it's free, and everyone who completes it gets a completion certification. So that can be fun for students too. This is a wonderful resource. So I'm gonna click over and show you the page because I think this is just phenomenal. So this is Facing History. Where am I? There we go. And it is this particular unit that I pulled up for you, but there's a ton of them in there, is Facing Ferguson, excuse me. And looking at the Ferguson protests, and it's news literacy in a digital era. This has 11 lesson plans in it for you. So for every lesson plan, it has the learning goals. It has the actual lessons, right, with embedded links and materials in them. And I went through every single one of these. These can be so easily modified depending on grade level and also depending on what you need it for, right? So if you're teaching an English class and you wanted to use this, that would be different than a government class, right? Or if you're teaching a high school journalism class. But talking about why, the power of language, why we use images, how images can be manipulated, which I'm going to give you some resources on that too. Talking to people who are at the protests, right? And what are some of the ethical concerns of that? How journalists minimize bias, breaking news. One of the challenges that we have seen in our research of the Situation Room is having students grapple with this idea that what we know in breaking news and developing news, the facts change, right? That doesn't mean that the journalist is reporting it wrong. It means that as more information comes out, there is an evolving idea of what the truth is. And that, of course, if it's wrong, it needs to be corrected. But that if we say, early counts say this wildfire burned 50 acres, and then 30 minutes later, it's 150 acres, the 50 acres wasn't wrong. It's that the story is developing. So this talks about that too. I don't know. I just think it's a wonderful resource. I've spent quite a bit of time over the last few days going through it, and I've passed it along to a lot of my friends. But I would highly recommend, and it's not just this, so you can go through a ton of options, and it all has a media literacy, news literacy component to it. Okay, and then I'm gonna go back to my slides. Sorry. So many tabs open. Okay. All right. Can you see my screen now? All right.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. In terms of embedding it into the curriculum, so if you are teaching science or you're teaching math or you're teaching drama or fine arts, right? You may not have the flexibility in your curriculum, or it may not be as organic to your curriculum to build in complete modules. So it's important to really think about how we can include elements of news literacy. And I will say this, I actually think in some ways, this in some ways can be just as meaningful, if not more meaningful, because you're applying it and making it very practical to the subject. So I'm going to show you, this is a video from MediaWise. MediaWise is a group that's associated with Poynter, which I had just referenced. And it's an amazing organization, and my students have really taken to it. But they put out videos produced by young people for young people, talking about not just news literacy in general, but very specific things. So we'll watch this video and then we'll come back to it.
Hey guys, it's Amelie and welcome back to Is This Legit?, where we find and debunk viral claims online and teach you some fact-checking tricks so you don't fall for or accidentally spread misinformation. Today, we're going to be taking a closer look at a video which supposedly shows the Prime Minister of Japan wearing a Make America Great Again hat and holding a Trump 2024 sign while standing next to Vice President Kamala Harris. Take a look.
It is now my great pleasure to welcome the Prime Minister of Japan and to thank him for this visit, which is the first visit to the United States of a world leader since we came in office.
Now, to me, it's pretty obvious that this isn't real, but people get fooled by manipulated media all the time. Some editing is really convincing, and when videos get posted across platforms, the quality gets worse, making even basic editing techniques tough to spot. But there are plenty of easy ways to debunk these claims, so it's time to find out. Is this legit? So, while this upload on YouTube hasn't gotten much attention, it has been shared across platforms including Facebook, where it gets the most traction. So, to start out, let's check for details and red flags within the video itself. Just looking for things like that can be a great place to kick off fact-checking. The first thing that really stands out is that the hat doesn't appear to be moving with the Prime Minister's head in the way you'd expect. The position of the hat and the lettering always stays the same, which is a clue that this may not be real. Second, there's no real definition with the Trump 2024 sign. It's not really casting a shadow or reflecting any light. It looks like it was just copy and pasted onto the video. Lastly, if you look at the corner, you can see a faint watermark of a social media handle called @II_Donaldo_Trumpo. As a general media literacy tip, you always want to track down the original source of information. Searching for this handle, I found this Donald Trump parody account on Twitter. So clearly this wasn't meant to be taken seriously. Still, there are some other ways you can fact-check videos. In the past, we've used a tool called Fake News Debunker by Invid and WeVerify. I'll link the video up top. And last week we showed you how to do a reverse Google image search. Today we're going to be using a tool called TinEye. TinEye is a great reverse image search tool. Not only can you see if a photo is outdated by organizing results from oldest to newest, but you can also sort by most changed to see if the photo was manipulated or altered in any way. Here's how. I took a screenshot of the video, making sure that both Kamala Harris and Japan's Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga were in the frame. Heading over to TinEye, I uploaded the image and up popped a bunch of results from where the image exists. Looking through the results, it's clear that the Prime Minister wasn't originally holding the campaign sign or wearing the hat. One result that came up was from the New York Times. If you click on the compare button here, you can see how the two images compare in real time. Clicking on the result from the New York Times, they posted this video, originally from Reuters, and their website on April 16th. The description reads, Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga of Japan met with Vice President Kamala Harris ahead of his news conference with President Biden on Friday. And by putting the video title into Google, I was able to find a video from the official White House YouTube channel with their full conversation. None of these videos show the Prime Minister with any Trump gear. Finally, let's turn to a keyword search to see if any other sources have reported on this manipulated version. I typed in Kamala Harris, Prime Minister of Japan holding Trump into Google, which brought up this fact check from PolitiFact. They gave it a pants on fire rating, saying that Prime Minister Suga was not holding a Trump 2024 sign or wearing a red hat when he met with Vice President Kamala Harris. So we're gonna have to give this video a not legit rating. But seriously, there are plenty of free and quick tools out there to help you fact check these types of claims. You just have to remember to use them. As always, the sources for this fact check are down in the description, and if you ever need help checking a claim, feel free to send it our way or alert us by using the hashtag #IsThisLegit. Bye guys!
Okay, so if you encourage your students to follow them on social media, particularly Instagram, they do a great job of almost daily putting up videos that are really timely and that really address some of the bigger controversial misinformation issues related. Okay, let me get back to my slides. Sorry, hang on. Okay, there we go.
Hey guys, it's Amelie and
All right. All right. So for classes that are more related to science and math, one of the great ways to do this, and this would be awesome to also have a journalist come in and talk about this or Zoom into your class and talk about this, but how scientific data is interpreted or misinterpreted, or whether or not it's manipulated, it could not be a more important issue. And it is such a great opportunity as you are dealing with data or information or scientific analysis or experimental design, to have a journalist or to have a scientist come in and talk about how this is related to misinformation. If you think back to the beginning of this discussion, but also just seen going on since the start of COVID, this has been a big source of misinformation and disinformation. So sometimes unintentionally, but sometimes intentionally. And the consequences are dire. So if we are misunderstanding or if we are intentionally being fed wrong information about really important scientific information that is intended to sow dissent, to divide, to persuade, it can have really dire consequences for an individual, but also for a community. And it gives you an opportunity to have some real world application. Now, I know also I'm not naive. I know that these times are fraught with controversy, and sometimes these topics are hard to bring up in class and have people feel comfortable, right? I'm very aware of that. I am teaching an ethics class right now, and we are talking about some of these very difficult issues, even for college students can be, they can have some trepidation around talking about these, but it is a good opportunity to do some real world application. So even if you're not applying it to COVID, you can talk about community health, public health. You can talk about very specific, organisms. You can talk about viral spread, all of that stuff in the context of misinformation or disinformation. Okay, and then simulations. So you all just did one, and it can be tricky because of the technology, and it can be frustrating maybe because of the technology, but simulations for the most part give students a chance to immerse themselves in a very real world but low stakes environment. Now it might seem, when I say low stakes, I mean they're not really going to start a war, they're not really going to have to cover a community. So they know that, they're high school students, they're aware, but high stakes in that they are aware that they're being watched by their peers, right? And that can be intimidating for them, that can be stressful, it can be intense. So as we have studied, and I know some of you have participated in the in-person situation room, What we found is that it's obviously a great opportunity for hands-on learning. And across the board, simulations prompt students to grapple with subjects in a real and deep way. And it can result, simulated learning can result in long-lasting learning. And we see that across subjects: international relations, political science, math, from elementary school to college age. Simulations can really result in long-term learning in a different way than a typical curriculum could. One of the reasons we think that might be is because learning is social, and this is giving them a chance to work alongside their peers in a different way than they are typically given in a typical classroom setting, right? So not only are they trying to learn together, but they are trying to accomplish very specific outcomes in a simulated learning experience. And what we have found from our quantitative and our qualitative research on the Situation Room experience is that students are more motivated to talk about the news after the simulation, even 2 weeks after the simulation, with their peers. They're not necessarily more motivated to talk to the adults in their lives, but they are more motivated to talk to peers. That is significant because most of their news exposure is incidental through social media, through their peers. And because they tie more credibility to who is sharing a story versus what organization is sharing a story, it's significant that they want to connect over the news with their peers once they've had to struggle along as a news reporter or as a government official who is having to maneuver the news environment. But one thing that we have also found is that it's helpful if the simulation can have some follow-up or corrective action. So if you are in a simulation, you know, students aren't going to perform it perfectly because they're not journalists or they're not cabinet members in the White House, right? So giving them the context for what is correct, which the Simulation Room does, when mistakes are made, how it could have been done differently. That can be done in a debrief, that can be done throughout a simulation, but follow-up and corrective action is really important because what we don't want is for students to walk away thinking, oh, well, that's how easy it is to misreport on information, or that's how easy it is, right, for misinformation to proliferate. So I told you, in terms of plugging in reporters, we really want reporters to be meeting with all members of their communities. We want members of the community to know who local reporters are. It's significant in terms of building trust, but it's also significant in terms of building news literacy or bolstering news literacy. So this is a video that my research partner and I created. This is a reporter, Greg Lee. He's an alum of our program. At the time, he was a reporter in LA. He's now a reporter in San Francisco. And he is explaining, it's a quick video I'm going to show you all. He's explaining to the students as they're about to go through the Situation Room, his job, and mostly looking at transparency and sourcing. What we saw is that the students who were exposed to the video prior to going through the simulation did have longer lasting effects and had higher reported news appreciation, appreciation of journalists, and the desire to be more news literate. So we're gonna watch this and then we'll talk about it in just a minute.
Things are getting ugly throughout Orange County. We've already seen a number of candidates in local elections calling foul against their opponents and some of their actions. My name is Greg Lee, and I'm a reporter here in Los Angeles. That was me you just saw, reporting on the recent November election. My job is to report on what is happening in our communities: crime, politics, wildfires, schools, and sports. I've even been to the Super Bowl. I also get to tell stories of people who do extraordinary things to help a neighbor, a friend, or someone they have never even met before. These are all really important stories to tell, but no matter what the subject is, the most important aspect of my job is to make sure I'm getting the facts correct and making sure the viewers, that's you, can make sense of those facts. In order to make sure my information is correct, I need experts to help tell these stories, like when I interviewed LA Fire Chief Daryl Osby about the recent Woolsey fire.
I can tell you that at some given point, a determination was made to shelter the students in place, and I believe at that point that was a good decision. not to put those students in harm's way.
Like in this case, it is a journalist's job to make it clear where their information is coming from. Experts are an important part of the story. So are the people who saw an event happen or who've been affected by the topic of my story.
The jailhouse informants talking to somebody, what the evidence the sheriff's withheld or did not withhold, who cares?
While I'm reporting, I'm working with others who are also helping to make sure my stories are correct. Producers, editors, and photographers are all checking and double checking my stories before, during, and after we present them to an audience. As a reporter, it is also my job to update you as I find out more about a story. We call this following a story. I try to make sure to tell the entire story from beginning to end. Because my stories are broadcast on TV and streamed online, my photographer and I make sure that we are showing you as much video as we can to help you see how the story is affecting your community.
So I want to show you some video last night. Jory, we know you were there, of flames encroaching on the hillside above the campus. That fire eventually reached the far end of campus, destroying a car, a trailer, and some storage units. Students were sheltered in place in the library, cafeteria, and campus center. This as the rest of the city evacuated.
When I'm not on the air, I use social media like Twitter to share the stories I'm reporting on and to continue to gather information. On Twitter, I can connect with viewers and provide updates on breaking news. Social media is filled with opinions and incorrect information, so it is really important to make sure you are clear on who is providing factual information. I make sure that I follow credible news sources and other reporters who are careful journalists. I even check alternate sources that may challenge my own viewpoints. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about whether the news is trustworthy and if reporters are just sharing certain facts and hiding others. I hear some people saying they are afraid of the news and even tuning out because of it. The information overload can be scary, and here's what I can tell you. Reporters, sometimes we make mistakes, and when we do, we work really hard to correct those mistakes. Reporters make sure that you, the audience, understands everything that goes into the story. The many people we interview, the documents we look at, and if there's anything that could have influenced our opinion on the reporting of the story. And we never report on stories that we are personally involved in. The founders of our nation thought the role of a free press was so important that it's protected by the First Amendment. In just a few moments, you are going to see the First Amendment and some of the other amendments put to the test. Enjoy the Situation Room experience at the Ronald Reagan Library, and remember that whether you're assigned to the role of reporter or not, we all have a responsibility for true, accurate news. Good luck.
Okay, so that video, 4 minutes, specifically hits aspects that we wanted students who were going in, especially those who were going to be playing the roles of reporters, but also everyone in the Situation Room deals with information, right? And is dealing with the news, even if they're not on the press teams. And we did find a longer lasting effect, and in some cases, just effects from the video. So for all of the students that we studied, we divided them into 2 groups. So we would come on a Monday, they would see the video. We'd come on a Tuesday, they would not see the video. And we had almost 400 participants altogether. About 200 saw the video, 200 did not. We surveyed them before, immediately after. We did a debrief with them, and then 2 weeks later, their very generous teachers followed up with the survey. And we did see some long-lasting effects. So the idea is we want journalists to, in person, get to meet people via Zoom. But even if you can't, we do see that news literacy can be bolstered by materials like this. So we're hoping to develop, and there already are so many great resources out there, but more of these that can hit on specific digestible topics where students can learn something in a short amount of time before they participate in a simulation or a guided course or an asynchronous course or a full course in school or outside of school. Okay, I am almost done, I promise.
Things are.
All right. I wanted to just show some of these came up in that MediaWise video. But here are some additional resources. You see the TIN-I link. This is from the Stony Brook Center for News Literacy. So that was the other aggregate link that I sent out. TIN-I is where you can just drop an image in and it will show you what it matches up with, and it'll show you if the photo has been altered. Google image search, where you can also do reverse searches. And probably many of you are familiar with the Stanford History Education Group, SHEG. They're great resources. That's a resource where even, you know, my university colleagues here they'll find it as they're looking for something and they're like, this is an amazing resource. And it is not really developed for college students, but it is an amazing resource for so many levels. This handbook is actually available digitally, the verification handbook. So it goes through some of that, not just fact checking, but sources and credibility of sources. And then of course, the News Literacy Project, which we have mentioned many times, and Common Sense Media. Which I highly recommend if you haven't already, sign up for the newsletter. So I was gonna do breakout rooms, but I think we're a small enough group where, and we have a few, Mira, do we have a few minutes left? We have a few minutes left.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to see if any of you had been or have ideas for either where you would like to implement some news literacy education in your courses, or where you think you need to, or where you think your students need you to implement some news literacy resources in your courses. And I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but if anyone has any ideas of either where it's needed or where you would like to, or obviously where that meets in the middle, that would be awesome to share. And maybe we can just share some ideas. Where do you hear your students talking about issues of mistrust? Or I'm sure you hear the term fake news. In the Situation Room, we actually went back and looked, and the first time fake news was recorded in a tweet in the Situation Room was the day after the inauguration in 2017. And then we've counted it, I can't remember, Mara, but it's, you know, like thousands of times it has been tweeted in the Situation Room. But so that word and the awareness by most people of fake news has really been fairly recent, but the idea of distrusting the news hasn't been. So that could far exceed or go much further back than 2015, 2016, 2017. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I taught a dual enrollment U.S. history course this year, starting at Reconstruction through the present. And it was rough because at my school, we have some on both sides. There was a lot of talk of that. This coming year, half those students are also going to be taking my dual enrollment government class. And there is a specific chapter on the media and how the media plays in. So we really do focus in on that. And one of the things, you know, I've had a few students literally come up and say, where can I go and get news that's just the facts?
Mm-hmm.
And that's been hard for me. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, here are a few that I've seen that I feel are like that. But at the same time, go ahead and continue to look at both. Find a topic. If you're looking at a topic, go and find several different opinions that's coming out there. It's kind of like when you have two sides to a story. You got one side, you got the other side, and the truth lies in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's kind of what I tell. I'm like, it's out there. I mean, we've discussed in history class, propaganda, yellow journalism, you know, all of that to me is kind of interchangeable in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So and I'm like, don't just take it from one source, look at several sources, read several different articles. I look at it and I'm like, be careful the sources you look at. .coms, .orgs are normally opinionated versus .gov.edu, and try to point them in that direction. But definitely with my older kids, my juniors and seniors, teaching at the dual enrollment level, college level, you know, they're very, very interested in stuff like that. So I've tried to at least give them middle line ground, looking at a little bit of everything, and we do discuss it in class, and we do several news ed. I use a lot of news ed and stuff like that to look at.
You find, Melody, that they're receptive?
Yes.
Okay.
They are.
That's great.
That is the awesome part of my kids. They're not like, oh, I'm not going to listen to you. You know, they're very much, hey, what can we get? Whether they, and we do a lot of different opinions because I want them to be able to voice opinions and use facts to back it up. That's how I teach. Not just here's fact, but hey, we form our opinions from facts. Why are you saying this? And back it up with facts. Don't just say, well, I think, and blah, 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 you know, be strong in that opinion and facts. So they know that. And so they're really receptive and wanting to know my opinion and why. And I tell them, okay, so then what's your opinion and why? And we all discuss it without canceling each other out. Yeah. So there is no canceling out in my classroom. It's a judgment-free zone. And so they know when they come in, they can do that. And so we look at the media stuff as well. Mm-hmm. We do our best, because we're all human. We do our best to look at what's coming out in the media. And I try to stay away from social media sometimes, because again, they're headline readers versus article readers. So
yeah. Well, actually, they're not alone. I don't know the specifics. I'll look it up. It's something like 80% of articles that are retweeted are never opened. So it's not just young people, it's all people. Twitter has now asked, it'll prompt you if you try to retweet something that you haven't opened, it'll say, do you want to read this first? So it'll try to prompt, it has sort of that check in there. Yeah, David?
My experience has been that most students are more concerned about athletes and actors than they are about politicians and statesmen. Mm-hmm. And I teach a little bit of English and a little bit of U.S. history, and I find that to be frustrating.
Yeah, well, and that goes along with what we know about teens and new information consumption, not just news consumption, but information, is that they care more who is sharing it, right, than which organization is sharing it. So if an influencer that they follow, that student follows and cares about, shares some information, that's going to mean a lot more to them than the Washington Post, right?
Well, I don't understand why they follow actors and athletes when my college experience has been is that athletes don't show up to class. And I don't know about actors, but so I don't understand their fascination with it. And I suppose that's just a big disconnect because I'm old and over 50 and have done other things other than be a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, we could really pick apart that one, the fascination with actors and celebrities and influencers and even politicians. Some people fascinated by them too. Yeah. Liz, did you want to share? I just saw your message, sorry.
No worries. Yeah, I think it's important, like, with us to also share with kids about going and avoiding the echo chamber and confirmation bias. Mm-hmm. I'll do a lesson where we'll look at Fox, CNN, AP, and another newspaper, and what are the headlines? What's on the lead? What's bigger? And then they how are the headlines worded? And then choose one topic that's on multiple forums, and go through. What do you notice about the they copy the headlines? What do you notice about the headlines? Read the articles. What's common? What's not? So that the kids can kind of see. Different news organizations will do different things. I tell them, pay attention to the word choice. And we talk about things like voter ID, or are they talking about voter suppression? Are they talking about abortion or the right to life? Like all of these words that have meaning and are powerful. And it's a PBS lesson from Mediocrity. And then I have my kids create a Flipboard, and I tell them I want them to follow multiple news organizations and be on there so that they get news items populating from different streams, but that they still need to do their news literacy skills and do corroboration, do that lateral search for items. And that is just so important in the habit of mind. And then news literacy also it's very important for us to teach, and it's also like part of like the dispositions and skills that are embedded in what the students have to do if they're going to be going after the California Civic Seal of Engagement, State Seal of Civic Engagement. If we're teaching here in California, and I know other states have seals as well. That media literacy as a tool to be an informed citizen as they leave and go into their adult life is so important.
Mm-hmm. And Liz, thank you for sharing that. And along that, when I'm talking to groups actually of any age about news literacy, one of the other things, in addition to paying attention to headlines and when we're thinking about confirmation bias, I think it's really important that people are aware of how they feel when they're reading certain information. It feels really good when I read something that agrees with me or watch something that agrees with me. And it feels really bad, might feel scary or infuriating when it's something that disagrees with me. And just the awareness of how you feel in your body when you are consuming the news, whether it's watching or reading or listening, and if that feeling is what's directing you, the mindfulness of it can be really helpful, right? So I feel mad reading this. Oh, it's because it disagrees with me. I need to take a step back from that. Or I feel really good reading this, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's correct information, right? This headline makes me feel confirmed. That feels good. This headline makes me feel antagonized or hopeless, right? Or scared. That doesn't feel good. So also just being in your body and being aware of your body when you are consuming the news, I think is really, really important. That is it from me. I really appreciate all of you. I want to just, my hats off to each of you in your work as teachers. I hope you're having a restful summer. I really do. It's been a really hard year for everyone, regardless of when you went back to school or not. And I want you to know how much I respect the work that you're doing. I will share these slides with Mira and Carol. They will send them out to everyone. The link, it's a Google Slides presentation. But I also just want to put out there that if there's anything, even if you want to, and I really do mean this, complain about the news, or you have some specific, I really am happy to hear it. My email address is in the chat. My Twitter handle was in the presentation, but you'll get the slides. If there's anything I can do to support you or to provide you any additional resources, please don't hesitate to let me know.
Thank you all so much for being here today. Elizabeth, as always, that was fantastic. And Elizabeth and Liz, it was great to have you here joining in, and Rick and some others who've come to the library and done the sit room experience. We hope that you'll begin to return as the years move along and we begin to reopen. Newsflash, we're actually in the process of developing a 60-person news literacy simulation, and Dr. Smith and Liz Ramos are both helping with that as well, to be played in 2 different locations. So more to come, very exciting stuff. So that's just one of the many tools Dr. Smith talked about today. And thank you for sending the slides along. This has been recorded, so you'll have access to all of that wonderful information Dr. Smith shared. Thank you for being here. If you're interested in setting up some of the Sims in your classroom, reach out as well. It was really great to see so many returning faces and so many new as well. Thank you so much.